All right, so the question that I want to talk to you all about today is how do networks of neurons organize our perception and experience, really our representations of the world? And this is a really big question. It's really one of the fundamental questions in neuroscience. There are many, many ways to approach it. But, oh wait, it's not auto-advancing. All right, here we go. Sorry, okay, second slide. But there are some general principles that do seem to tie together these things from all different areas in the brain. And one of these unifying principles is this, which is that your brain is full of maps that really mirror the structure in the world. And when I use the word map, I don't just mean geographic maps like this, but it is a very related idea. A geographic map is a representation of the world, and the reason that maps are useful is that relationships between things out there in the world are mirrored on this piece of paper. So for example, when I move from point A to point B in the world, say a distance of 20 miles, the map representation of my location moves from a corresponding point A to point B, say 2 inches. Now, geographic maps capture structure in the world that's relevant for navigation, namely two-dimensional distance. They also throw out a ton of other information. And representations in the brain are a lot like this. So the first brain maps were discovered in the late 19th century. It began with a neurologist observing how seizures spread through the body of his epileptic patients. And he noticed that seizures would spread smoothly throughout the body, for instance, starting in the leg and moving up towards the waist. And he began to hypothesize that motor control had a map-like organization. Seizures are neural activity spreading through a brain region, and his hypothesis would explain the corresponding spread of seizures throughout the body. Now, researchers were actually able to chart this out in motor cortex by stimulating electrically in the brain and finding a smooth movement corresponding in your sensation and motion. This is commonly called the homunculus, or little human in the brain. What's interesting to note is that the amount of cortical space dedicated to a body part is proportional to how important it is rather than how big it is. So small but useful parts like our hands get a lot of neurons while others get a tiny sliver of space. And this highlights an important principle of neural representation, which is that the brain doesn't necessarily represent things as it are, it represents things as they're important. It's a transformation. But critically, it preserves relationships between things. And this is really what brain maps are all about. Now, primary motor cortex looks like a geographic map, but the concept of a map in the brain is far more general. It's actually related to this concept from math called a homomorphism, which is a transformation from one set to another that preserves relationships. Now, just like in this image here, this graph of nodes can be transformed into many different geometric shapes that look completely different. But between all of these transformations, the relationships between the nodes and edges remain the same. And that set of relationships doesn't need to be spatial like distance. It could actually represent any sort of relationship, such as a change in color or orientation, so long as that system of relationships obeys certain axioms. Mathematicians call it a group structure. Now, the world is full of transformations. Everything that we need to keep track of is constantly transforming, but in highly structured ways. And the brain mirrors this structure in its neural representations. So when there's something out there in the world that rotates, there's a sense in which something in your brain rotates as well. Another way to say this is that cognition is a homomorphism from the world to your brain. Your brain is learning ways to map the world into neural activity that reflects the structure and preserves the important relationships out there in the world. So this is illustrated beautifully in what's called the head direction circuit in the brain of the fruit fly. In the fly brain, there's an elegant circuit that has perfect ring shape, shown here on the right, and this circuit is responsible for tracking the direction of the fly's head. It can be described as a homomorphism from the geometry of the problem, which is shaped like a compass, to this little toroidal-shaped set of neurons in the brain. And so you can see as the fly moves around in the world, you can watch a ball of neural activity rotate around this ring. So that's this little green ball of electrical activity as the fly orients itself on the sphere here. So the generality of this principle is also illustrated beautifully in the domain of sound, where the information coming in is truly non-spatial. So in your ear, there's this structure called the cochlea, which is responsible for converting sound waves into neural impulses. And inside of your cochlea is this little snail-shaped structure. Inside of the cochlea is this fluid-filled structure called the basilar membrane, which vibrates when sound hits it. And the basilar membrane is thick at one end and thin at the other, so the frequency that resonates each part changes smoothly as you move along the membrane. So high-pitched sounds activate cells at one end, and low-pitched sounds activate cells at the other end. And this creates a spatial map of tones that are preserved throughout the auditory system as sounds are processed in the cortex. This is just one of many more examples of the surprisingly elegant principle that neurons use to represent the world around us. Now, the idea of maps in the brain has been around for a really long time. Famously, the phrenologists of the 1800s hypothesized that personality traits could be mapped onto the spatial regions of the brain. That idea wasn't quite right, but the framework of brain maps helps us find things like the homunculus that are actually two-dimensional maps. But this new mathematical perspective gives us a whole new space of things to look for. If we're equipped with the mathematical machinery to describe more complex aspects of structure in the world, then we can start from the geometry of the world, and then we know what to look for in our brains. And that's it.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear Sonia? Because I couldn't hear Sonia at all.
Yes.
Good? Okay, cool.
I hear Sonia.
I will keep an eye on the hand raising, and then you can come up and ask your question. I'll keep track of the timing too, because we're going to do this for about 7-ish minutes, and then we'll have a small break if you want to run to the bathroom or get a snack or something. So, looks like Connor has his hand up right now, so if he wants to come up to the rug and ask his question, we'll kick this on.
Okay. Sorry, this is my first time. So I come to the, like this area? Is that right? Okay, I hope you can see me and hear me. Yeah, great talk, Sophia. So my question is, are there any like parts of the brain, well, sort of two things. Is there any parts of the brain that we don't understand, or are there any things in human consciousness that we haven't yet located in the human brain?
Oh, absolutely. Maybe I'm painting too nice of a picture of brain organization here. I really kind of cherry-picked all of the most structured parts of the brain that we do understand decently well. But probably the majority of the brain is still quite confusing. And when you look, for certain parts of the brain, like in visual cortex, you can look in and it kind of looks like there's a map in there. You can kind of see, if things move left to right, things kind of move in a corresponding way in your brain. But the representations are totally different in other parts of the brain. And that's what I think makes this kind of approach, thinking about the mathematics of the problem, really important, because for most problems that the brain is trying to solve, it's not just a 2D map. It's actually, there's this set of relationships that is much more complex and much more structured. And if we don't really know the structure of the problem, we won't really know what to look for in the brain. So a lot of neuroscience research has, come up empty-handed, thinking that things look kind of random. And I think, a large part of that is that we just didn't have the right mathematics to describe the kinds of problems that those brain regions are trying to solve.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? I got a question, so I'm just gonna go for it. Did this advance more with the kind of MRI, fMRI kind of technology that allowed to see the kind of more direct brain usage?
Yeah. So actually a lot of really cool work has been done charting out something like a semantic map in the cortex using fMRI research with human subjects. And what's really nice is that you can see this sort of spatial configuration to semantic content. You can kind of chart it out. You can classify words based on the, being objects or about animals or humans or relationships or visual information. And if you kind of plot that out as a color map over the cortex, there's all this nice organization and structure. And so fMRI has been really important for trying to understand these types of maps in human brains where you can't do necessarily electrophysiology studies, and you can look at the global organization. That's been really, really cool and insightful.
Nice. Looks like maybe Lola has a question. Wanna go for it, Lola?
So I'm wondering if there are parallels between the structure of the brain and sort of other organizational systems within nature and also maybe social organizations, and how sort of this distributed network of communication between parts of the brain is mirrored in other kinds of organizations in other parts of the rest of the world.
Yeah, totally. I think actually that this idea of mirroring the structure of the thing that you're trying to model, it echoes in all kinds of other different kinds of computational systems. And it's a useful principle of computation, whether that's computation in like a colony of ants, which are doing sort of an interesting distributed computation and communication, or if that's in a single, biological entity, even just a cell or an organ system. So this is kind of like a really general principle that I do think applies across other domains, and it would be really interesting to think about how this works in like the context of social networks or social organization as well.
Thanks, Sophia.
Renata had her hand up.
And Sophia, if you want to unshare your screen, we can get a bigger picture of you as you're speaking just by double clicking on you, I think.
Does that work?
Yes.
Cool.
Okay, this was actually a question from Jamie, but so first of all, it's fascinating to be able to see like how they measured brain activity of a fly. Like that's just absolutely stunning. But I was curious about when you were talking about the cochlear and how that maps direction and how sound is not actually coming in a directional way. But I only kind of caught some of it. I was hoping you could elaborate about how the brain does that. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the cochlea is just like a string on an instrument, like a violin. It has this different resonant frequency, except rather than being one string, it's a string where one side is really, really thin and one side is really thick. And so the low frequencies, like low pitches, resonate one side, and the high frequencies resonate the other side. And so basically sound comes in and you're vibrating this coiled up organ. And then depending on which part of which location on the string starts to vibrate, that starts to simulate these hair cells which are connected to it, and that sends a signal to the brain. And so it's kind of taking this non-spatial information and arranging it out into this one, this linear dimension, which is frequency, and then converting it into neural impulses. And then that relationship, that map, is now preserved throughout all of the auditory processing as you move through the brain.
Whoa.
Wow.
Fascinating. Thank you. That's so cool.
All right, we got Chris up next for a question. Oh, Chris, where are you? There's the rug that I am standing on at the front that allows everybody to hear what you are saying. I do not see you in the room. Where are you? Yeah, if it's in the chat. Where's Chris? By the door.
Okay, can you hear me now?
So up here at the rug. There you go. Stand on that rug and.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Hello?
Hello.
Honey, can you get him quieter? Okay, can people hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Wow. So my question is about QEEG. And yeah, what are its benefits? How easy is it to use? What can it not do in terms of detecting how brain regions connect to each other?
Did you say QEEG
Yeah.
or just EEG?
No, QEEG, quantitative EEG. From what I've read, and I'm no expert, it seems like a way of checking when two brain regions are in sync or talking to each other.
Mhm. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem with EEG is that the spatial resolution is very low. So EEG is a way of detecting electrical signals all over the sort of the surface of your scalp, which are coming through your brain. The big downside is that spatial resolution super low, but you do get very good temporal resolution. And so it's very good for detecting things like synchrony and telling when two brain regions are in sync with one another. But you know, a lot of the brain things are happening on a really, really tiny spatial scale, like really small circuits of neurons, very localized parts are doing computations that are important. And so thus far, EEG is only really able to give like a broad global picture of you know, with a coarse grain of what's happening in the brain and on a temporal, you know, sort of giving high temporal resolution but poor spatial resolution. And yeah, hopefully, you know, there's been a lot of people developing new methods which are, you know, can give you a better compromise between the spatial and temporal resolution.
Thanks.